No one wanted the 55-year-old widow until a grieving sheriff read her letter. The letter smelled like lavender and wood smoke both. I don't know why I noticed that. A man doesn't usually notice a thing like that. But I'd been sitting at my desk for 3 weeks with nothing in front of me that mattered, warrants I hadn't filed, a coffee cup I kept forgetting to rinse. And when Deputy Alcott dropped that envelope on the stack, the smell hit me before I even touched it. Her name was Clara Finch, wrote from Meade County, Kansas. She was looking for land in the territory. That was the whole of it on the surface. She'd heard from her cousin that the Cherokee Strip was opening, and she wanted to know what a woman alone ought to bring, what she ought to expect, whether the county seat had a doctor or at least a man who'd pretend to be one. Practical questions, everyone. I set it aside, picked it up again that evening. I'd lost my wife 14 months before. Fever. 3 days from fine to gone, and the doctor said he'd done what he could, and I told him I believed him even though I didn't, not entirely. You say the thing that's expected. You go on doing the expected things. I'd been sheriff of Woodward County for 6 years, and I went on being sheriff because the alternative was to sit in that house until the walls fell in on me. I wrote Clara Finch back. Told her about the run, the land, the doctor, a man named Hennessy who trained somewhere back east and wasn't a drunk, which was more than you could say for the previous 2. Told her the land north of the Cimarron was good if she didn't mind wind, and the land south of it was better but filling fast. I didn't tell her why I was writing at 11 o'clock at night, by lamplight, with my dead wife's quilt still folded on the chair across the room. She wrote back inside a week. She had opinions. That was the first thing I understood about Clara Finch. She thought the way I'd described the strip made it sound like a circus, and she wasn't wrong, and I told her so. She asked whether a woman could file a claim alone and hold it alone without some man deciding she couldn't, and I said I didn't see why not. The law was the law. She wrote back that in her experience the law and what men decided to do about the law were 2 separate matters, and I laughed out loud at that, which surprised me. The sound of it in that quiet house. She was 55 years old. She said so plainly in the 3rd letter, the way a person mentions the weather, a fact with no apology attached. Her husband had died 7 years prior, left her a small farm in Meade County that she'd worked alone since, and now her daughter had married and moved to Missouri, and there was nothing holding her to that particular patch of ground. Nothing holding me, she wrote, is both a terrible thing and a useful one. I've been trying to decide which it is longer. I read that sentence 4 or 5 times. I knew what she meant. God help me, I knew exactly what she meant. The run was set for September the 16th. I had duties that day, keeping men from jumping the line, which they did anyway, keeping the peace along a frontier that was about to cease being a frontier, which felt like watching something die while everyone celebrated. 60,000 people that day, they said afterward. I don't know if that's right. All I know is the dust, and the sound, and the way the land looked after cut up into claims, tents already going up, fire smoke rising from 100 places that had been empty grass that morning. She was somewhere in that. I didn't know where. I didn't know what we were, me and Clara Finch, except that I had 7 letters from her in the locked drawer of my desk, and I'd read each one more than once. I found her claim 3 days later. I told myself I was making rounds, checking on settlers, which was true, it was part of the job. Her claim was northeast of town, just shy of the Cimarron, and I rode up to find her driving a stake into the ground with a mallet like she'd been doing it her whole life. She heard the horse and turned around. She was not what I'd imagined. I don't know what I'd imagined exactly, some softer version of a woman, I suppose, which was foolish given the letters. She was square-shouldered and sun-browned, and her hair had gone entirely white, and she looked at me the way you look at a man when you're deciding whether he's worth your time. "Sheriff Lyle," she said. "Mrs. Finch." She said, "You look worse than I expected." I said I'd had a long few weeks. She said, "I know, you told me in the 4th letter." She set the mallet down. "Come down off that horse and have some coffee if you want it." I stayed 2 hours. I came back the following Sunday. She was building the claim herself, framing the cabin with lumber she'd hauled out from town piece by piece. I helped. She didn't ask me to and didn't thank me formally when I did, just handed me the end of a board and said, "Hold that level," and we worked until the light was gone. That was how it went for a while, working mostly, talking while we worked. She asked me about the county, about the law, about what I'd done before I was a sheriff, and I told her 4 years in the cavalry, 2 years driving cattle, a brief and undistinguished attempt at homesteading that ended when I realized I had no feel for the land. She laughed at that, not cruelly. She said, I have too much feel for it, it's my failing. I said I didn't see how that was a failing. When something goes wrong with the land, she said, it goes wrong with me. When my husband died, I couldn't work the East Field for 2 seasons because he's the one who'd broken it, and it felt wrong too. She was driving a nail when she said it, evenly, not looking at me. That's too much feeling. You need some distance. I thought about Ellen, my wife, about how I hadn't been able to eat at the kitchen table for months because she'd always sat across from me. I said, I don't know if distance is possible. She stopped hammering, looked at me. No, she said, I don't suppose it is, I just meant you learn to live around it. In November, a man named Cutter tried to jump her claim. It happens. It happened all fall, men who'd missed the run or who'd drawn a bad lot looking at a woman alone and deciding the math was simple. Cutter was a big man, not stupid, and he came with a deed that was convincing at a glance and wouldn't hold up to anything more. I'd dealt with 3 like him already that month. The law was clear. I served the papers, gave Cutter his options plainly, and he took the one that didn't involve a jail cell. Clara wasn't there when it happened. When I told her about it, she said, thank you, and then she said, I could have managed it myself, you know. I said I knew. But it's different when it's the law, she said. It carries differently. I told her that was the point of it mostly. She was quiet a moment. Then, you came out yourself, you didn't send the deputy. I said the deputy had been busy. She gave me a long look. She had gray eyes that didn't miss things. All right, she said, and then she said, stay for supper, which was not a question. The bad month came in January. I don't know how else to say it. I'd been doing well enough, or what passes for well enough, which is mostly just movement, mostly just the next thing and the next thing after. But January came cold and slow, and the house got quiet in a way I hadn't felt since the early weeks after Ellen. And one morning I sat down at my desk at 6 in the morning and didn't get up until noon. I missed 2 appointments. Alcott covered for me and didn't ask why. I thought about just stopping, not anything dramatic. I'm not speaking of that, but stopping in the sense of laying down what I was carrying and not picking it back up, resigning the badge, going somewhere that didn't know my name, or not going anywhere, letting things settle around me like snow until I was covered. I didn't write to Clara that week. I don't know if I thought she'd notice. She came to town on a Thursday. She didn't come to the office. I think she knew I'd find a reason to seem busy. She came to the boarding house where I took my meals, and she was just there at supper, sitting across the table when I came in, hat off, hands folded, and she said, "You stopped writing." I sat down, said I'd been occupied. "You've been inside your own head," she said, "which is a terrible place to be occupied." She pushed a cup of coffee toward me. "Eat your supper, I'll talk." She talked about the cabin, about the mare she'd bought from a Cheyenne man at a fair price, about the way the snow looked on the Cimarron from her door in the early morning, blue-gray and still. She talked the way a person talks to keep the room from going quiet, and I understood what she was doing, and I let her do it. When the food was gone and the place had emptied out, she said, "You were a good sheriff before your wife died, and you're still a good sheriff. That doesn't go away because you're in pain." I said I wasn't sure about that. "I'm sure," she said, flat and plain, no argument in her voice, just fact. "I've watched you, you're careful with people, you remember what they tell you, you show up." She picked up her gloves from the table, turned them in her hands. "Showing up is most of it, Will." She'd called me by my name. She hadn't before, not out loud. I didn't say anything for a while. The lamp was burning low. Then I said, "I'm glad you came." She said, "I know." She stood up, put her gloves on. "Come out Sunday. The mare needs someone to decide if she's sound, and I don't entirely trust my own judgment on horses." I said I'd come. She said, "Good," and walked out, and I sat there for another few minutes just breathing. Spring. The Cimarron running high and brown, cottonwoods leafing out. Her cabin was finished, real roof, real floor, a good chimney that drew properly. She'd planted a kitchen garden and was fighting the rabbits for it with a persistence I found genuinely admirable. I asked her one afternoon. We were sitting on the step. The sun going down warm and orange behind the tree line. I asked her why she'd come all this way, really. Not the official answer. She thought about it. I wanted something that was mine, she said. Not inherited from my husband or left to me by accident or handed over out of pity. Something I staked and built and decided. She looked at the land in front of us, all of it lit up. And I thought maybe out here a woman who's 55 years old is just a woman who's 55 years old, not a woman who ought to step back and let somebody else. I said that seemed about right. She looked at me sideways. Nobody in Meade County wanted a widow my age, not really. Neighbors were kind about it, church people were kind about it, but kindness isn't the same as, she stopped. It isn't the same. I knew what she hadn't said. I said, I want to be clear about something. She waited. I'm not being kind, I said, when I come out here. That's not what this is. The sun was almost down. Out in the grass something moved, a coyote maybe, or just the wind. She turned and looked at me straight on, the way she'd done that first day when she was deciding whether I was worth her time. And then something shifted in her face, something that had been held careful went a little loose, and she put her hand over mine where it was resting on my knee. She didn't say anything, neither did I. The cottonwoods moved, the light went the rest of the way down. Her hand was warm and rough from the work, and she didn't take it back. We married in June in the yard of her claim, with Alcott as witness, and the Cheyenne man she'd bought the mare from. His name was Standing Elk, and he'd become something like a neighbor, and the circuit preacher, who was 22 years old and nervous but adequate. There was no ceremony to speak of. A few words, a few names signed to a piece of paper, and then she was standing next to me in the sun squinting against it. This square-shouldered, white-haired woman who had staked her own claim and driven her own stakes, and who had come to a boarding house in January because she'd decided I was worth the trouble. I thought about Ellen. I thought about grief and how it doesn't end, it just learns to live beside other things. I thought about 7 letters in a locked drawer. I put my arm around Clara's shoulders. She was solid against my side, warm. She said quietly, so only I'd hear it, "You're all right, Will Lyle. You've been all right the whole time." Standing Elk was saying something to Alcott about the mare. The preacher was folding his papers. The land ran out in every direction, grass and sky, and the line where they met. I didn't answer her. Didn't need to.